Exactly 2 years later in West Valley City, Damiana Castillo was murdered. The crime had many similarities to Mejia's murder. Mejia was strangled inside her Taylorsville apartment, a crime that stunned those who knew her.
Tonight, a suspect in those murder cases is finally behind bars.
Cold cases are complex, not just for the families, but for the investigators who put in blood and sweat to solve each case. So, what changed after decades? How were these 5 cold cases finally put to rest? Welcome to Mysterious Hook, where we shed light on mysterious cases across the country. I'm Matt, and today we are looking at 5 cold cases that were finally solved in 2022. Let's dive into these cases without further ado. Mary Jane Thompson was born as the 3rd daughter to her father, Norman Thompson, and mother, Lenore, in 1962. As the years went by, 2 more daughters would join the happy family from the small town Cheektowaga in New York. From a young age, Mary Jane had big dreams of being a model. She used to dress up, walk, and even practice talking like a model, so she could one day be one. But that did not take away from her kind and thoughtful nature. After graduating from Cleveland High School, Mary Jane started her life afresh. From California to Houston to Los Angeles, she lived in all these big cities for short spells before ultimately deciding to begin a new chapter in Texas. The 4th of the 5 sisters, Selena Tomasello, remembers the last Christmas she spent with Mary Jane before Mary relocated from her hometown. With her own money, Mary Jane got Selena a stereo system and their other sister Kathy a portable stereo called a boombox, gifts that were invaluable for those little girls. Still, they did not realize who purchased them until their sister moved away. The thought never crossed their mind that it would be the last holiday they would ever spend with Mary Jane. In 1983, a 21-year-old Mary Jane moved to Dallas, Texas, determined to fulfill her aspirations of being a model. Her dreams were indeed huge, but the young girl never hesitated to work hard for them. During the 6 months of living in Dallas, Mary was working 2 jobs, full-time in a florist supply shop and part-time in a local restaurant. However, most of her income went into paying for her acting and modeling classes, something she hoped would help her break into the industry. On February 11, 1984, at around 4:30 p.m., Mary Jane Thompson left her part-time job as a hostess at the restaurant near Lovers Lane and Greenway Drive. She took a bus to the Trinity Medical Clinic, located on the former Industrial Boulevard, to get a checkup for an ear infection. However, she was unable to do this as the clinic was closed. Tragically, that was the last time she was ever seen alive. 2 days later, on February 13, 1984, the authorities were called to a warehouse on the 2300 block of Irving Boulevard in the Stemmons corridor of Northwest Dallas, Texas, after a female body was discovered near the railroad tracks behind the warehouse. It was evident upon inspecting the crime scene that this was a homicide. Police quickly identified the victim as 21-year-old Mary Jane by an ID card found in a nearby gym bag. The bag contained 1 leg warmer, while the other was wrapped around her throat. Her pants appeared to have been cut from her body. The body bore a bite mark and numerous other bruises. The autopsy confirmed that she was sexually assaulted and then strangled to death with her own leg warmer. Unknown bodily fluids were also found on the corpse and preserved for later usage. However, this evidence wouldn't come into play for a very long time, as DNA technologies were not as advanced in the 80s as they are today. As authorities were unsuccessful in gathering further clues, the case began to turn cold. Although neither investigators nor the family lost hope despite decades passing by, there were no fresh leads to follow up on. Her family always posted her pictures and spread her story to keep her memory alive. It wasn't until 2009 that any formal action could be taken in the progress of the investigation. Nearly 25 years later, in 2009, the Dallas Police Department reopened the case, and male DNA was discovered on swabs taken from Mary Jane's autopsy. But the DNA never matched a specific suspect, so the case went cold once again. In 2018, the police once again opened the cold case after Mary Jane's sister Selena called the investigators requesting a re-investigation using new DNA technologies. The investigators worked with a team from the district attorney's office, while the FBI also joined the task force in 2020. In the same year, they began a thorough search on genealogical websites using new technology like ancestry databases to identify potential relatives of the suspect based on DNA collected at the crime scene. The search narrowed down to a single suspect, 60-year-old Edward Morgan. Morgan was just 22 years old in 1984 and was a familiar face in the area as he lived a few miles away from Mary Jane's workplace. To confirm their suspicions, the FBI agents then surveilled Morgan's West Dallas home for a week, where he lived alone. On February 15, 2022, a Dallas police detective and an FBI agent grabbed the trash that Morgan had dumped in front of his house. From it, a soda bottle and 2 water bottles were sent to a lab to undergo forensic testing. The DNA from the bottles positively matched the DNA taken during the autopsy. On February 18, 2022, after 38 years, Morgan was arrested and charged with capital murder. Her family was grateful to the investigators, who never stopped working on the case. The news brought closure to the family as they finally knew who was responsible for taking Mary Jane away from them. Selena wrote in a Facebook post, "I know you are looking down and happy that they finally got him." Sadly, their father, who wanted nothing more than to find his daughter's killer, did not see this day as he passed away in 2020. Morgan is currently being held in jail, with his bail set at $500,000. Viola Hagenkord was born on August 16, 1900, and grew up in a lovely home. Not much is known about her life. After divorcing her husband in 1928, she never remarried or even dated someone. It was before the Great Depression when the divorce occurred, and Viola swore off men for the rest of her life. Despite loneliness, she never complained about anything in her life. She was known as a happy, generous, and friendly woman among family members and neighbors. In 1980, Viola was living in the Pebble Cove apartment complex, located on the 2500 block of West Winton Road in Anaheim, California, after moving from her longtime home in Milwaukee. Apparently, her family believed that the apartment complex in Anaheim was a safer community for a lone woman, which was also closer to the family members, a decision that would come back to haunt them. Viola regularly chatted with other residents and visitors outside her apartment and was often seen walking around the building. One of her neighbors, who was a high school student at the time, found Viola very sweet and called her grandma. She often took cookies to the elderly woman. In the evening, she propped open her door with a Campbell's soup can, a worrisome habit for an elderly woman, according to some neighbors who thought it was unsafe. Concerns would no longer be only concerns for the well-wishers of Viola in the early 1980s. A neighbor grew worried when Viola was not seen leaving her apartment for several days. They entered her apartment on February 18, 1980, only to make a horrific discovery. When authorities reached the scene, they found the elderly widow's body sprawled out on her bed. She was gagged with a torn pillow cover, which had been forced into her mouth. Multiple ribs of her body were broken due to a merciless beating. Bloodstains were found on the bed under her pelvic area, and empty beer cans were found in the apartment. The cause of death was suffocation from the gag in her mouth. Although there were no marks of a forced entry into the apartment, signs of struggle were present in the bedroom. It was concluded that the old woman tried to fend off her assailant, but turned out to be no match for him. The medical examiner ruled that she was brutally raped before her demise, and semen was collected from the body. Viola was only 6 months shy of celebrating her 80th birthday when her life was ended in this heinous manner. However, the question of who raped and killed the elderly woman had no straight answer. Despite some physical evidence, investigators were far away from identifying possible suspects. Eventually, they would have to wait 4 decades before the mystery would be solved. As years went by, this case became one of the oldest cold cases in Anaheim City. In September 2020, the detectives decided to reopen the cold case. It was time to reinvestigate the case under the light of new DNA technologies, which had successfully brought closure to several decades-old unsolved cases across the country. With assistance from the Orange County Crime Lab and the FBI's Violent Crime Task Force, using new DNA technologies, a possible suspect was finally identified in 2021. The suspect in this horrendous crime was Andre William Lepere, a man who struggled with alcoholism throughout his life. Due to his alcoholism, he lasted only a year in the military as he was discharged following an alcohol-related car accident. Along with alcoholism, he also had a reputation for abuse. In 1980, Lepere and his wife separated, and she filed a restraining order against him. Lepere was not a complete stranger to Viola. Lepere's sister Denise lived in the same apartment complex where he lived for some time and met Viola a couple of times. Sometime in the 90s, Lepere moved to the east, living in several places, including Washington, Wyoming, and Arizona, and New Mexico. There he worked as a truck driver as well as a plumber. He married twice, had 2 children, and went on to live his life peacefully until he was arrested in April 2021 from his Alamogordo home in New Mexico on the charge of murder. In the trial, Lepere said that his connection to Viola was much more than meeting a couple of times. He claimed that Viola seduced him, and they had consensual sexual encounters on 2 occasions, one shortly before the murder. But he denied killing or beating her and said that she was alive and well and was even giggling when he came out from her apartment. Though his current wife, sister, and stepson didn't believe that he was capable of killing someone, his story of being seduced sounded ridiculous, and the jury did not buy it. On May 13, 2022, a 65-year-old Andre William Lepere was convicted of the murder and sentenced to life imprisonment for the murder of 79-year-old Viola Hagenkord in 1980. With a resolution after 41 years, Viola's family said in a statement, "Our grandmother, Viola Clara, was a beautiful, happy soul and did not deserve being violated in her final years of life. They were grateful, however, that the killer was brought to justice." Born on May 5, 1976, Sonia Mejia achieved the American dream at a young age. By 2006, at the age of 29, she was living with her common-law husband and her 8-year-old son and was 6 months pregnant with her second child. They lived in the Pleasant Fairway Apartments, located at approximately 11th West and 3900 South in Taylorsville, Utah. To support her family, she worked part-time at a local McDonald's, but the dream would be shattered one fateful morning in early February 2006. Sonia was home alone on February 9, 2006. At around 6 p.m., her husband returned home from work and made a gruesome discovery. He called the authorities after finding his wife breathless and unresponsive on the floor. The crime scene clearly pointed towards a homicide, which investigators concluded to be a robbery gone wrong. An autopsy on Sonia's body later showed that she had been sexually assaulted before being killed by strangulation. Tragically, Sonia's 24-week-old fetus also did not survive. Multiple items were missing from the apartment, which included 3 pieces of jewelry that belonged to Sonia, a heart-shaped ruby ring, a diamond ring, and a religious pendant fastened to a gold chain. Her car, a gold 4-door Ford Escort, was also stolen from the apartment and was located 4 days later in the parking lot of the Fairfield Inn at 590 West and 4500 South. Unidentified fingerprints and DNA evidence were discovered inside her apartment in the form of a bag of Cheetos and a Coke bottle, items that were not supposed to be there. So, investigators concluded that they must have belonged to the killer. Unexpectedly, the investigators found a witness after interrogating neighbors for information. At around 11:30 a.m. on the day of the murder, a neighbor saw a Hispanic male talking to Sonia at the front door of her residence. The witness then observed him entering the apartment and assaulting Sonia. The man grabbed Sonia by the throat and struck her with such force that she fell to the floor, and then the assailant kicked the door shut. Sadly, even after witnessing the violent attack, the neighbor failed to alert the authorities, which ultimately cost the young mother her life. The man was described as a short-haired Hispanic male with a medium build, approximately 5'6" in height and 20 to 29 years in age. Though it was deemed enough evidence to identify a suspect, police were unable to do so despite having fingerprints and a physical description of a killer. The authorities believed it to be a random attack until 2 years later, when the killer struck again on the same day and in the same area. Damiana Castillo was born in Mexico City, Mexico, on March 18, 1950. Little is known about her early life, but she was a loving mother and grandmother. She was known to have a very gentle attitude and shared kind words and blessings with everyone she crossed paths with. One neighbor described her as a prompt lady who had never been late for work and never forgot to attend church. Her 2 children, 1 son and 1 daughter, and her 5 grandchildren adored her to death. In 2008, 57-year-old Damiana lived at an apartment at 4000 South Redwood Road in Salt Lake City, Utah, just a mile from where Sonia Mejia used to live. Sadly, here too, on a tragic February morning, police would be called to witness a horrific crime scene. On February 9th, 2008, Damiana's son went to check up on his mother after she did not show up at church like she did every Sunday. There, poor Damiana was lying in her apartment, partially covered with a pillow with ligature marks on her neck. Police noted the signs of a fight in the apartment, including an overturned table. Damiana's pocketbook and wallet were found abandoned on a couch, and her jewelry box had also been disturbed. DNA was collected from the victim's neck, while a latent fingerprint was found on her purse. At first, this murder was believed to be a separate attack, similar to Sonia's. However, excluding the age factor, these 2 murders had extreme similarities between them. But from 2009, investigators conclusively believed that it was the deeds of one person after the biological evidence linked both slayings. Nonetheless, both cases could not be solved at the time due to the DNA and fingerprints not matching a person present on the criminal database. In 2010, prosecutors used the DNA profile to charge the unknown suspect with 2 counts of aggravated murder, referring to him as John Doe since his identity could not be specified. The killer earned his name as the February 9th killer, indicating the date of the crimes. Though the killer was not considered a serial killer, for years, police in West Valley City and Taylorsville would have extra officers on patrol on February 9th in order to prevent a third slaying. Over the years, these 2 cases received much-needed media attention, but no particular breakthrough could be earned through that. It would all change in 2016, when the FBI maintained automated fingerprint identification system reported that prints taken from the scene had been matched to a person, Juan Antonio Arreola Murillo. Arreola is a 41-year-old Mexican resident who was living in the U.S. in 2008. According to court records, he was arrested by Salt Lake City police in July of the same year for a fraud and theft case and pleaded guilty. The address listed for Arreola in the 2008 case was the same apartment complex where Sonia was killed. However, he had multiple other addresses listed in court records, and it was unclear if Arreola was indeed a neighbor of either Sonia or Damiana. Arreola was deported from the U.S. back to his home country, Mexico, in October 2008 and has been living there since. In 2017, prosecutors amended the John Doe charges and the court issued an arrest warrant for Arreola. Although the killer's identity was unfolded to the investigators, it was not public due to the suspect living in another jurisdiction. The charging documents were unsealed after he had been extradited to Utah from Mexico. He was charged with 3 counts of aggravated murder, 2 counts of aggravated burglary, and 1 count of aggravated robbery. If found guilty, he could face life in prison without the possibility of parole. Helen Margaret Bruck was a hard-working elderly woman who lived her life to the fullest until it was tragically cut short. Helen lived all by herself in a 2-bedroom apartment at the Garden Apartment Buildings in the Mojave Desert town of Apple Valley, California. She was a well-spoken, attractive, and respected lady in the community, and everyone had only good things to say about her. A tenant would later describe her as a cautious woman due to her living alone in the apartment. Helen was very dedicated to her work. For 20 long years, she worked for San Bernardino Valley College in the food services department. However, she later shifted to a different work line to experience other things in life. In 1985, Helen was working 2 jobs. She sold clothing at a fashion boutique called Lolo's in the Apple Valley. Admirably, 63-year-old Helen would model for the clothes that the store would put on fashion shows. She also worked as a bookkeeper at a store right across Highway 18 at the bowling alley, which at the time was known as Gold Strike Lanes. On July 5, 1985, a Friday, Helen did not show up for work, an extremely unusual thing for her to do. Her boss called and called, but nobody answered. The concerned co-workers then called the sheriff's department for a welfare check. When officers drove down Highway 18 to the Garden Apartments, the door of Helen's apartment was unlocked. They found her lifeless body lying inside as they entered the scene. Not much evidence was present at the crime scene. However, DNA was collected from the scene, but nothing came of it since DNA technology was in its infancy back then. Autopsy results concluded that she died from strangulation by a nylon stocking. Despite conducting several interviews and polygraph tests, detectives could not identify a positive suspect, and the Apple Valley murder case remained unsolved for many years. In 2009, the case was re-examined, and numerous items were sent for DNA testing. A DNA profile was developed for a suspect, but there were no matches in the DNA database. Then, in 2021, cold case homicide investigators reopened the case and conducted further analysis of the unidentified DNA profile. The testing produced positive results, identifying a suspect named Robert Eugene Wortman. Wortman was a former resident of Apple Valley who lived close to Highway 18. The name was not entirely unknown for the investigation. As a matter of fact, Wortman was considered a person of interest in the original investigation and was even interrogated at the time. Investigators learned that Wortman, then 37, met Helen in the days before her murder and returned to her apartment between July 3rd and July 5th. However, he claimed to have no knowledge of the crime and even denied going to the apartment. Due to a lack of evidence, investigators could not prove his involvement in the murder. As fate would have it, he didn't stay a free bird for long. In August 1985, just a month after he murdered Helen, Wortman was arrested on suspicion of attempting to rape a woman at the Cocky Bull restaurant and bar on Highway 395 in Victorville. He also had a Sonoma County rape conviction from 1978. With an extensive, sexually violent criminal history, Wortman died in prison in 1995 while serving a 22-year sentence in San Bernardino County. Janet K. Yeary was born on May 14, 1953, as the only daughter of her parents, Winford and Mary Ann Runyon. She grew up in a beautiful home in Tipton, Indiana, with her 2 brothers. She graduated from Tipton High School in 1971 and focused on having a family. By 2004, 51-year-old Janet was living in Kokomo, Indiana, close to her daughter's place. She was a lab manager for 16 years at C&B Optical One in Kokomo and had been an excellent worker. Janet and her daughter Carly Martin lived in separate houses in the same community on North Appleton Way in Kokomo. Carly's home was just across the street from Janet's place. This allowed Janet to play with her granddaughter, which was her favorite thing to do. She had several other hobbies, including doing yard work, spending time on her computer, listening to music, and wandering outdoors. Holidays were a massive deal to Janet. She loved having a feast with her own cooked dishes every holiday, even if the gathering was small. Turkey, salads, desserts, everything would be arranged by Janet to enhance the celebrations. The Thanksgiving of 2004 wasn't anything different either. The family planned a midday meal due to Carly's evening shift at work. The family was to meet at Janet's place and enjoy the Thanksgiving meal. So, on the eve of Thanksgiving, on November 25, 2004, Janet began preparing a large Thanksgiving meal at her home. Sadly, it would be the last thing she ever did. The following day, November 26, 2004, was Black Friday. Carly kept calling her mother after Janet missed the Thanksgiving dinner. Panic struck her when repeated calls were unanswered. She had a gut feeling that something terrible had happened. Growing concerned, she went to her mother's place to check in on her. The garage door of Janet's home was open. Carly unlocked the front door with a key and walked into her mother's home. There, 51-year-old Janet was lying, dead. The turkey was in the oven, which was still running. From the conditions of her body, it was apparent that she had been brutally murdered. With a broken heart and tears in her eyes, Carly called the police. The Kokomo Police Department arrived at the house a few minutes later. There was not much evidence to collect from the crime scene. Although some blood was found at the crime scene, it was not enough to build a DNA profile. Police theorized that Janet most likely did not know her attacker, but let them in for some reason. Preliminary reports suggested that a struggle had taken place between Janet and her attacker. From the fact that the food had been left half done, they also concluded that Janet had been dead from the day of Thanksgiving. The murder shocked the close-knit community of Kokomo. No one had any idea who would want to kill a sweet old lady who greeted everybody. The crime scene was not giving away anything either. Although Janet's mourning family wanted nothing more than for her killer to be caught, with a lack of evidence, the investigation was not going anywhere. There were some sightings of a possible killer, as police found out in their investigation. Some neighbors had seen a white vehicle leaving the area at high speed around the time Janet was murdered. Still, the information did not lead the police anywhere. A ray of hope was seen 2 months after the murder when police identified a person of interest. Danny Case, a resident of Peru, had reportedly been going door to door to call for a ride. He seemed like a possible killer after a previous report indicated that Danny had been wanted in Miami County on suspicion of murder. 2 months later, on January 25, 2005, investigators got a big break when Danny ended up being apprehended when he was arrested at Indianapolis International Airport on an outstanding warrant. But before Kokomo detectives could speak to him, he hung himself in his holding cell at the airport. According to Kokomo police, all the evidence pointed towards one man, Danny Case. However, there was insufficient physical evidence linking the deceased man to the crime. For years, people speculated the possibility of Danny being the killer of Janet without ever coming to a conclusion. Perhaps the case would remain forever in the cold case files if a witness had not come forward decades later. On January 14, 2022, Kokomo police announced the closure of Janet Yeary's murder case due to a recent break in the investigation. According to the police, an acquaintance of Danny Case had recently come forward and told investigators that Danny once confessed to him about killing an elderly woman on North Apperson, right where Janet lived. The acquaintance had further said that Danny knocked on the woman's door, asked about using her phone to call for a ride, and then killed her. In addition to Janet's death, Danny had also reportedly told the acquaintance that he had beaten an elderly man to death in Howard County. In light of this new information, Kokomo County investigators met with Yeary's family regarding the closure of Janet's case. After a lengthy conversation, the family finally agreed to officially close the case with an exceptional clearance due to the suspect being deceased. So, after 17 years, this cold case was solved with the perpetrator eluding mortal justice. We understand this is a difficult time for the family, as these conversations open the wounds that the senseless tragedy left with her family. A statement said in the press release, "Our condolences remain with Janet Yeary and her amazing family. We pray for peace for all of you."